Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf further discusses the halacha of cooking on Yom Tov. As we know, you're allowed to do melacha that is involved in food preparation, the baking or cooking or things like that, in order to eat on Yom Tov, for food preparation on Yom Tov, but that's only for a Jew, a human Jew on Yom Tov. There are three things which would seemingly fall outside that category, and those are cooking for the sake of a nachri to eat on Yom Tov, cooking for the sake of an animal to eat on Yom Tov, or cooking for the sake of gavoa, cooking for the sake of hektish, karbanos, to be eating on Yom Tov. The Gemara will compare and contrast those three things. The Gemara will also discuss when it's something where melacha is being performed, which is half for a permitted type of cooking and half for a forbidden type of cooking. And the Gemara will go into these halachas. So first, let's begin. The Gemara compares two cases of half malacha. So the Gemara says, what if you want to slaughter an animal? Slaughtering is, of course, a malacha, which is permitted only for cooking. What if you want to slaughter an animal which belongs half to a Jew and half to a nachri? So Gemara quotes Rav Avia, who asked this question to Rav Huna, and he said that it's permitted. You're allowed to do that shechita because half the animal belongs to a Jew. So Gemara says, how is that different than shechting a carbon, slaughtering a carbon, which is nedarim and nedavos? That is an optional carbon. Part of that carbon will go in the mizbeach, which is not a permitted use, and part of that carbon will be eaten. Some of those carbonos are eaten. So that's just like an animal, which is half belonging to a nachri and half belonging to a Jew. This is a carbon which is half going on the mizbeach and half being eaten by a Jew. So if it is permitted to slaughter the animal which belongs half to a Jew, it should be permitted to slaughter a carbon which is half going to be eaten by a Jew. So Gemara says Rav Avia Saba asked this question to Rav Huna, and Rav Huna said, oh look, there's a raven flying by, meaning to say, leave me alone. And Rav Avia walked away with his head down. He was upset. He was embarrassed. And Rabba, his son, the son of Rav Huna, asked Rav Huna, why did you push him away? Didn't you say that this is a great Talmud Chacham, Rav Avia's Saba? Why did you just reject him like that and not answer his question? So Rav Huna answered, and he said, I just gave a long shir in Hilchos Yom Tov. I'm very tired and worn out, and he asked me something which requires deep thought. It's a good question. I didn't have the ability to think about it now, so I pushed him off. So the Gemara says, what is the answer? The Gemara says, the answer is as follows. The act of a shechita is not a problem as long as part of the animal is going to be eaten in a permitted way, because the shechita is fully needed to permit any part of that animal to be eaten. As long as there's a concise here that'll be eaten in a permitted way, that is a permitted shechita. The problem with the animal that's a carbon is the entire carbon is hektish. It all belongs to gavoa. None of it is a permitted shechita. What do you mean? But Kohanim eat part of it. Kohanim eat the chaz v'shok. That's what they are being given from shulchan gavoa. They are being given a portion from the hektish. But it's not that it's being given straight to them. It's not that you're doing shechita for them. You're doing shechita for hektish, and then hektish gives it to them. So that, therefore, is forbidden. Okay. Now, the Gemara now compares this case to the case of malacha for food for a dog. So the Gemara quotes of Chizda says that an animal which belongs half to a nachri and half to a Yisrael is permitted to slaughter on Yom Tov because that slaughtering is fully needed to permit even the tiniest kazayas. But if you have a doe which belongs partially to a nachri and partially to a Yisrael, that is forbidden to bake on Yom Tov. Yom Tov, I should say, all along. That is forbidden to bake on Yom Tov. Because Yom Tov, you do not have the principle that shechita, the principle that we have that a shechita is fully required for every kazayas, you don't have that for the baking. You can't say the baking is fully required for every kazayas, every tiniest amount of the dough. You could break the dough in half. You could bake the part of the dough that belongs to the Yisrael and not bake the part of the dough that belongs to the Nachri. Therefore, you don't have the right to bake the Nachri's dough along with the dough that belongs to the Yisrael. Whereas a kash on that from Rav Chana bar Chanilai, who has a case, he quotes a case of the dough that was made for a dog. Apparently there was a very low quality, made with bran, of dough that was made for dogs, and sometimes it was edible by humans. Sometimes the shepherds would eat them as well. So this Beitzah that he brings says that if you have a dough that's made for dogs if the shepherds do eat from it, so it has the halacha of regular bread and dough. It's obligated in the laws of challah. You have to take off challah. You can use it for an erev chatzeros. You can use it for a shitufei mavais. You have to make a bracha on it. You have to say brachas hamazon on it. You can do a zimun on it, and you're allowed to bake it on Yom Tov. You're also allowed to use it for matzah. So Gemara says, why are you allowed to bake it on Yom Tov? Part of it is being used for dogs, and part of it is being used for people. According to your principle that you can't just bake the whole thing and say, well, I'm baking the whole thing all at once because part of it is for people. You have to separate the people part from the dog part. Why should you be allowed to bake this entire thing, including the dog part? So Gemara answers that the dog part, you could theoretically eat it. Could be a situation in which you will eat it. What's that? The Gemara says because you could give the dog a piece of meat instead. You could have a piece of nevela and say, here, give me back the dough and here's a piece of meat instead. Since you could theoretically do that, it's permitted. It could be viewed as people food because it theoretically could be eaten by people. So Gemara says the problem is that this is Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda doesn't hold to the concept of hoel. He doesn't say that something is permitted since theoretically you could make it permitted, therefore it has the permitted halacha. Someone says, okay, you're right, we're not talking about a case of theoretics, we're talking about a case where the person really has a piece of nevela and he wants to give it to the dog and take it away and take the dough away from him in order to eat it himself, and therefore it's not theoretical. You really, you're permitted to bake it because you can actually eat it. Okay, the Gemara now has a question that was asked from Rav Huna, was asked to Rav Huna. People from villages that often have flour that's given to them by the king, and the king orders them to bake bread for his army. So they're allowed to do that baking on Yom Tov. So that army, those are nachrim, and therefore it's not permitted to bake for them on Yom Tov. Is there a permitted way to do this baking on Yom Tov, especially if they're ordered to? So Gemara says, yes, if the soldiers will allow a child to eat from their bread, so if you bake this, every concise you bake could theoretically end up being eaten by a Jewish child, and therefore it's permitted to bake on Yom Tov, even though most of it will be eaten by the army. Since each particular concise could theoretically be permitted to be eaten by a Jewish child, therefore it's permitted to bake the entire thing. So Gemara has a question on this. Gemara says it was a Beitzah which quotes an incident that happened with Shimon HaTeimani. He didn't come to the Beis Medrash on Yom Tov. The next day, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava found him and said, why don't you come to the Beis Medrash? He said, because a troop came to our city and they were installing themselves in the village. We were supposed to feed them and support them. Instead, we slaughtered a calf for them, we gave them food to eat, and they left us alone. So he said, very nice that you get rid of them, but I'm not sure you did the right thing, because you did a slaughtering of an animal on Yom Tov in order to feed two nachrim. Who says you're allowed to do that? So the Gemara says, why is that a problem? According to what you're telling me, that it's permitted to bake the bread for the troop, because it could be eaten by a Jewish child. So this calf could have been eaten by Jewish kids also. Could have been cooked and eaten by Yisrael, so that should be permitted as well. So my answer is no. His problem was because the calf that they slaughtered was a treifa, was not a kosher calf, and therefore could not have been eaten by a Jewish child. The Gemara says, well, it could have been fed to Jewish dogs. The Jews could have fed it to their dogs, and therefore that is a permitted reason that should make it permitted to slaughter it. So the Gemara says, are you sure that you're allowed to slaughter an animal in order to feed it to your dogs? An animal which is a treifa, you want to slaughter it to feed it to your dogs. Who says you're allowed to do that? Matter of fact, that's a machlokes. The machlokes tanaim. The Gemara quotes the Beitzah. Understanding the pasuk which says it's permitted to do malacha for food on Yom Tov, the pasuk says, "Ach asher ye'achal chol nefesh hu levad ye'asal lechem." You're only allowed to do malacha, which is needed to feed kol nefesh, all souls. Says the Gemara that the Tanna Kama learns this as follows: all souls includes animals. It says all souls, like it says "Maki nefesh behema yishal mena." The phrase nefesh could refer to animals. It says nefesh behema. But the word lechem comes along, and that excludes animals. It says only for you, not for animals. You're only allowed to do malacha to create food, prepare food, to feed people, not to feed animals. That's the opinion of Beitzah Daf. And Rabbi Kiva says, no, you're even allowed to use it to feed animals. It says lechem. Lechem is to include nachrim, is to exclude nachrim, not to exclude animals. This is why should I exclude nachrim? Maybe I should exclude my dogs. Who says I could exclude nachrim and not my dogs? Maybe I should exclude my dogs and not nachrim. The Gemara says no. Since you're responsible for the feeding of your dog, it's closer to your feeding. It's closer. It's as if you're feeding. It's more properly viewed as feeding yourself because it's your own needs, as opposed to feeding nachrim, which is not your responsibility, and therefore we cannot view that as included in lachem. The Gemara now continues the conversation by blending the halachos of muktzah together with the halachos of cooking for a nachri on Yom Tov. The Gemara says that Abaye said to Rav Yosef, according to Rav Yosef Aglili, that says you're only allowed to cook for people and not for animals, not for the dogs. How are you allowed to feed date pits to animals on Yom Tov? Date pits are muktzah; they have no function. Therefore, you should not be able to move them to feed them to animals. If we said that it's permitted to do malacha to feed animals, I understand. But you're saying it's forbidden. According to Beitzah Daf, so how could you move the date pits? It's muktzah. So he said it's not muktzah, it's firewood. You can use it for firewood. So he says, okay, that's good for dried date pits. What about the damp, fresh date pits? Don't burn. So he said, well, if you have a big enough fire, they burn. This is okay, that's good for Yom Tov. We shouldn't be allowed to do that on Shabbos. Shabbos, you can't tell me it's firewood. You're not allowed to throw anything into the fire in Yom Tov. So Gemara says no, because you can move it if it's on a piece of bread. Like the Halacha of Shmuel says you're allowed to move anything by having it be put onto bread. If you spit the pit out of your mouth directly onto bread, you're allowed to move the bread, and the thing that's on it is moved along with it. You could feed it to a dog that way. Otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to. Okay, now continuing the blending of Hilchas Muktzah and Halachas of cooking on Yom Tov, the Gemara refers back to the statement of Rav Huna. Rav Huna had said that you're allowed to bake the bread for the troop, the soldiers that are stationed in your house, and you're obligated to bake for, as long as it could potentially be fed to a Yisrael child. So Gemara says that does not fit with the opinion of Yeshua ben Levi, because Yeshua ben Levi said you're allowed to invite a nachri to eat with you on Shabbos, but not on Yom Tov, because Yom Tov you're going to cook for yourself, and you may end up cooking extra for a nachri, and that's not allowed. You're not allowed to cook for a nachri on Yom Tov, and therefore you should not invite him to your house on Yom Tov. Shabbos you can't cook even for yourself, there's no problem. Now obviously this doesn't fit with Rav Huna, because he would have said that you're allowed to do that cooking because you could potentially end up feeding it to a Yisrael child. So Gemara says that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says there's a different reason you should not invite a nachri to your house on Yom Tov, and that applies on Shabbos as well. And that's because he's going to drink wine, and there'll be wine left in his cup, and that wine is yayin hesach, and therefore you can't do anything with it. It's muktzah. You'll end up clearing off the cups with this muktzah wine in it. You'll be violating an isser muktzah. So Gemara says, I have news for you. Wine that's left over in a Jew's cup is also muktzah, because it's disgusting. Somebody drank from it. It's just as muktzah. So says, no, we could feed that wine to chickens. Gemara says, we could feed the leftover yayin esach to the chickens too. Gemara says, no, yayin esach is that's bahana. Not allowed to feed that to your chickens. Gemara says, well, you should be allowed to move it because it's in a cup. Muktzah objects which are insignificant, which are in a significant object, like muktzah wine inside a cup, you should be allowed to move the cup. Shouldn't be a problem. Just like Rava says, you're allowed to move a ash holder because of the ash that's in it, and the ash is used to cover things up, and you don't have to worry about pieces of broken wood that are in there that are muktzah. So Gemara says that's different because it's not Isser Hana. Those are mild halachos. Isser Hana has stricter halachos. It's more muktzah than regular things. So Gemara now asks, so we'll let this wine in the cup be a graf sharei. The halacha is something which is disgusting and vile. You're allowed to move out of your way because it's bothering you with its disgustingness. So Gemara says, true, if you're in that situation and you have it, it does count as graf sharei and you're allowed to move it away, but you're not allowed to set up a situation lechatchila which you'll end up having a graf sharei that you'll need to move away. So you're not allowed to invite the guy to your house, end up creating a graf sharei situation that's not allowed. The Gemara says that Rava and Rashmuel went for a walk, and they say that the halacha is you're allowed to invite a nachri to your house on Shabbos, but not on Yom Tov. And again, the reason is, like we said in the first place, you may end up cooking more for him. Maryam and Marzutra had a permitted way of doing it. They invited a nachri, and they said, just you should know we're not going to cook anything for you. If it's enough for you, what we have for ourselves that's left over for you, fine. Otherwise, don't come because you're not going to eat. We're not going to prepare anything extra for you. Okay, the Gemara moves on. Now we have two Mishnayos. So the first Mishnah brings the machlokes of Hillel and Beishamai about heating water to wash your feet or to warm the body. So first it says machlokes Beis Hillel and Beishamai about heating water to wash your foot. Beishamai says you're not allowed to. Beis Hillel says you are allowed to. Beishamai allows it if you may end up drinking it. If it's water that you could drink, so then it's ochel nefesh, it's considered to be food. But washing your feet does not count as a food requirement. Now, food is always lav daf. It's not specifically food. It's any requirement of the body. Beit Shammai says washing your foot doesn't count. Beit Hillel says it does. Now, there's one last line in the Mishnah which we don't know who says it. The Gemara will discuss. It says you're allowed to make a bonfire to warm yourself. So Gemara asks, who said that last line? Is it Beit Shammai? And Beit Shammai allows you to make a bonfire to warm your body because the need of the entire body is considered ochel nefesh, is considered food. It's only washing a foot that's not considered food. Or is this Beit Hillel? And the only reason it's permitted because Beit Hillel says a need for the body is considered to be the same as food. But Beit Shammai would say no difference if it's for your whole body or just for one foot. You're not allowed to do it. So Gemara resolves it by quoting a Beitzah. Beit Shammai says you cannot make a bonfire. Beit Hillel says you could. So this last line must be only a statement of Beit Hillel. Now we get to our next Mishnah, which brings 3 halachos that are said by Beit Shammai, and Rabbi Gamliel paskin in accordance with these 3 strict halachos. Halacha number 1 is that you're not allowed to insulate hot water on Yom Tov in order to have for Shabbos, which follows. Next, you're not allowed to straighten out a menorah that the Gemara assumes toppled over. And the third thing is you're not allowed to bake thick bread. You're only allowed to bake thin bread. Too much work to bake thick bread. Just bake thin bread that you're allowed to do. Now, Rabbi Gamliel says, in my father's house, they never baked thick bread on Yom Tov, only thin bread. And they said to him, your father was extra machmir, he was extra strict upon himself, but the rest of concise, all the halachas that you are allowed to make thick bread, you're even allowed to make kohl cakes. All these things are permitted for you to make. Okay. The one I want to know, what are we discussing here in these cases, specifically where you are insulating hot water? Do you have an erev tafshilin or not? If you have an erev tafshilin, you should be allowed to do it. If you don't have an erev tafshilin, you're for sure not allowed to do it. How is there a machlokes Beit Hillel Beit Shammai about this topic? So the Gemara says, we're talking about you do not make an erev tafshilin, but certain minimal requirements are allowed to be done even without an erev tafshilin. Again, we're referring to something which you're doing on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Certain minimal things you're allowed to do even without an erev tafshilin. This is Rav Huna, where he says elsewhere, somebody did not make an erev tafshilin is allowed to bake a minimal amount of bread, allowed to cook a small stew, and is allowed to light a candle. Rav Yitzchak says he's even allowed to roast a small fish. And we're bringing a Beitzah that says this as well. Somebody made an erev tafshilin is allowed to make a little bread, insulate a little pot, light a little candle, and warm up a little bit of water, and some say, and actually roast a small fish. And this is allowed because a minimum amount of necessary life requirements are permitted.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.